Welcome everyone. We'll get started. We'll get started now. So thanks for being here for the awards session of Utts 2021. We invited Jessica Utts to give a presentation here. It's a really strange invitation to have given. I'm sure it was a strange invitation for Jessica to have received. It's strange in the sense that if we were face-to-face, like all previous Utts have been, we would have just had a really nice banquet dinner. The awards ceremony, the awards session is right after a really nice banquet dinner when everyone's happy and relaxed and in a good mood and all. And we sort of know what an after dinner talk is at a conference. It's a really challenging talk to give, but you sort of know what an after dinner talk is. I don't really know what an after dinner talk is without the dinner that's happening at 12:47 in the afternoon, California time. But that's what we asked Jessica to give here. And that's what she is going to give. And I'm sure it's going to be terrific. For those of you who don't know Jessica taught in the University of California system, first at Davis and more recently at Irvine. Jessica's been involved in statistics education for a very long time now. She got her PhD from Penn State, where Bob Carey and Dennis Pearl and many others are. In fact, I've been told that Jessica was the first woman to receive a PhD in statistics at Penn State. Jessica is well known in statistics education for her textbooks, for her writings, for her presentations. Jessica served as the chief reader for AP Statistics for several years. Jessica also served as the president of the American Statistical Association a few years ago. And I'm delighted that Jessica accepted our strange invitation to give this strange after dinner talk preceding awards, but without the dinner part. So if you'd advance one slide, please, Kelly or Bob. Let me just show everyone what our plan is for the next hour here. I guess we're on Jessica's slides. Let's stay on Jessica's slides. Let me just tell you the plan. Jessica's going to give her talk, roughly half an hour. Then we're going to acknowledge the winners of the amusing competition. We're going to hear from the winning jokester and the winning poets, and we're going to play videos of the winning songs. And I believe that the composers and performers of those songs will be with us. And then after that, we will give the George Cobb Award for Lifetime Achievement in Statistics Education. So that's our plan for the next 56 minutes here. And I should have said that before I introduced Jessica, but we'll run with it. So thanks again very much, Jessica, for doing this. And we look forward to your talk on data science ethics.
Okay, thank you, Alan. When Alan asked me to give this talk, he said, since it's an after dinner talk, you should try to either be humorous or thought-provoking. And I thought, well, I can't compete with the humor that comes after this, so I'll be thought-provoking instead. And hopefully that's what this will be. So data science ethics, a checklist for statistics educators. I want to start with a caveat, which is that this is actually an abbreviated version of a previous talk that I've actually given twice. But I couldn't resist adding some controversial new content that's been in the news in the past week. And so I had to cut out even more of the old stuff. And so what I'm going to do as I go through is I'm going to refer you to the previous talk and the paper that was published on the topic, if you want more detail on some of these examples. And so there are the links there. My homepage, just go to my homepage and you'll find these. So when you see the double red asterisks, you can know that there's more information in the previous talks and the paper. So think of this talk as kind of a sampler of these topics. So here's the outline. I'm going to set the stage with some history that goes back to the beginning of my teaching career. Then I'm going to talk about the frightening present in data science ethics and how we as statistics educators can help, and then focus on encouraging statistical literacy. So let's start here. So this is a history that goes way back to the beginning of my teaching career, as I said. And one of the students in one of my graduate classes, who was from another department, told me this story. An engineering professor gave an assignment in class. He asked the students to design a pipeline to send blood from a poor developing nation to a rich developed one. So the students got to work. They discussed the optimal conditions, how to go under a body of water, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then after letting them go on for a while, the professor told them they had all failed, because not one of them had questioned the ethics of the assigned task. To which the indignant students responded, "This is a class in engineering, not ethics." So that story really stuck with me, and I think it applies to all of us and what we teach. And the moral of the story should be, we need to be training our students to ask why they're doing something before asking how to do it. And if it's unethical to do it, they shouldn't be doing it at all. It's not always clear cut. There are pros and cons to most of the things that are being done these days with data science. So you need to ask who might benefit, who might suffer, what are the trade-offs? I'll give you an example. I know a young man, I guess he's in his 30s now, has a master's degree in statistics, and he happens to work for one of the GPS map programs. I won't tell you which one for proprietary reasons. So I asked him for examples of ethics that arise in his work, and he came up with this. Is it ethical to send everybody the same route when they're leaving a large event like a concert or a sporting event, when you know that those roads are then going to be clogged within a few minutes? Or should they divide the people up and send them on different routes? And then we got discussing other possibilities. So here's another one. Is it ethical to send cars through high crime areas? Is it even ethical to identify high crime areas, or does that place a stigma on them if it's known that no, the MAP program won't send you that way because it's a high crime area? Is it ethical to send pedestrians through high crime areas? If you think it's okay for cars, what about pedestrians? Is it ethical to increase traffic in residential areas? And then if you think that's okay, what about in school zones? So these are all non-statistical questions, but they have ethical implications, and data scientists have to deal with them. So let me move on to why I chose this topic for my previous talks and for this one. It's everywhere. So the New York Times had this special section, Ethical AI. Why AI must be ethical, how we make it so. Two beautiful books on this topic, Weapons of Math Destruction, subtitled How Big Data Increased Inequality and Threatens Democracy. And then Hello World, Being Human in the Age of Algorithms. I highly recommend them if you haven't read them. It's everywhere. Okay, why else? Well, I've noticed that our students are getting jobs in non-traditional statistics jobs. So it used to be easy, you know, they did statistics. But now the lines are really blurring between among data science, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and so on. And our students' jobs are reflecting this crossover. So the traditional ethical issues for statisticians, like the ASA ethical guidelines that are currently being updated, but I think the version that's on the web is still from 2018, they're not enough. They're not complex enough. They don't deal with the new ethical issues that these blurred lines are creating. So we need to educate students on the ethics of decisions and interpretations, and not just our own graduate students or undergraduate majors. We have to educate everybody as data scientists, obviously, but also some of our students will go on to become members of these multidisciplinary teams that are considering these issues, even if they are not the data scientists. And also just as consumers, they need to understand these ethical issues. So I think it's a really timely and important topic. Here's an example that's in more detail in the earlier sources that I gave you. ACLU did a study where they used the facial recognition system that Amazon offers to the public. They used the default settings. They fed in a database of over 25,000 arrest records, so photos of people who have been arrested. And then they fed in public photos of all 535 at the time, members of Congress, and they got 28 matches. In other words, 28 of these congressional members were identified as potential criminals. Well, you may think they all are, but in this case, they had matches to the faces that were in this arrest database. And they were disproportionately members of color, including many of them from the Black caucus. But, you know, facial recognition software has benefits. You know, if one time I was boarding an international flight and they said, oh, you can put your passport away, we don't need it, just look into the camera. So, you know, faked documents will be harder to use in the era of facial recognition software. So there are those trade-offs. Here are other data science ethics examples. Biases in hiring algorithms caused by biases in the training data. Algorithms used by judges to decide who's likely to commit another crime. I have an extended example in my ISI paper about a program called Compass, which does not use race and ethnicity explicitly, but it does use questions that probably are different for different races and ethnicities, like at what age did you first encounter the police? Medical diagnostic algorithms that are trained on data that exclude certain subpopulations. One that has some meaning to me, using genealogy databases to solve cold crime cases. There was the first instance of that was done was a guy who was committing crimes 50 years ago in California. Oh, I just gave something away, how long I've been here. Anyway, the summer I moved to Davis, he was raping women in Davis. And then he went on to a murder spree throughout California. And they used a genealogy database, DNA database, which also happens to have my DNA in it. And so I was interested in this one for multiple reasons. So here are a few examples from the media of just what I've been talking about, just some headlines here. And again, you don't have to look very far to find these kinds of examples all throughout the media. Okay, so this is the new example that I couldn't resist adding. This is from June 22nd, so it's very recent. And one of my colleagues happens to be quite involved in this example. So you've probably heard that the FDA approved the first drug for a long time that is designed to address, I wouldn't say treat, address Alzheimer's. And then despite some staff concerns. And then here's the first paragraph of this Wall Street Journal article. The US Food and Drug Administration approved the first new Alzheimer's drug in decades over the objection of agency statisticians, who said there was insufficient evidence to support approval, according to newly released internal memos. Okay, so what's the controversy? Well, let's go back a few years. Here's a 2019 article. The search for new Alzheimer's disease treatments hit another big setback on Thursday when drug makers, Biogen and Eisai companies said they would terminate 2 late-stage studies of an experimental drug after determining it would likely fail to help patients. Well, that's the same drug. So what happened in the meantime? Well, long story short, there were 2 phase 3 clinical trials, and their primary endpoint was a measure of cognitive and daily ability to function. So cognitive dementia rating scale, sum of boxes, abbreviated CDR. Normally, the FDA requires 2 studies with consistent results for drug approval, and at least one of them has to be statistically significant. So in this case, what happened was the only study that showed statistical significance was study 302. And remember, I didn't tell you, but that was terminated early for so-called futility. It looked like it wasn't going to work if they continued to test it. The other study actually showed results in the opposite direction for the high dose group. So the FDA asked the panel to ignore that one and use a preliminary study that had been done while designing these more definitive studies instead as their second study. So there were 11 people on the advisory panel for this. 10 voted against approving this drug and 1 abstained, and several have since resigned from the committee. Let me tell you more. After that study was terminated in 2019, remember early for futility, and was unblinded, Biogen continued to look at the data. So I don't know if you can see this, but remind you of anything? Yeah, that's a fisherman fishing. This is data fishing. And what they found was evidence of reduction in beta amyloid plaque for drug versus placebo. So that's the plaque that accumulates in the brain in Alzheimer's patients. So they approved the drug for 9 years provisionally based on that surrogate outcome, not the cognitive functioning or daily functioning. And there is no convincing evidence that reduction in amyloid improves cognitive functioning. And in fact, there was evidence, they did find it when they just looked at the high dose group in study 302, they did find evidence of better cognitive functioning. But when they looked at that same group in the other study, it was in the opposite direction. So what? Well, the drug costs $56,000 a year. Medicare is still reviewing whether or not they're going to approve it. It has serious side effects, including brain swelling. It was only tested in patients in the earliest stages of the disease, even in the studies that were done. And because it was not effective in reducing clinical symptoms, how are doctors going to know if it's working? And therefore, if the patient should continue to take it? The only way to look for amyloid reduction is to do brain scans. More so what? The FDA gave provisional 9-year approval based on running a new study. In other words, the companies are supposed to run a new study during those 9 years. But who's going to enroll in the new study if they're getting a drug paid for when they could possibly be given a placebo instead of the drug? Well, people probably who don't have insurance or can't afford the current drug, and that's going to be a biased sample. And then suppose during those 9 years, a different new drug is proposed. Should new studies compare that drug to a placebo or to the Aduhelm, which is the one that's just been approved? And then what endpoints should be used in the new study, given that the previous study failed to show a benefit for the cognitive test that's most commonly used? So these are huge issues. And the statistical issues that we can see in here, well, the original clinical outcomes were contradictory, so they started fishing. The results had already been unblinded at that point. Only patients in the earliest stage were tested, so there's no way to know if it works for those with longer term Alzheimer's. And future studies are likely to be biased because of who will be willing to enroll. So these are statistical issues, and I think also raise ethical issues about the approval of the drug. Okay, so what can we do to help with data science ethics? Let's go there. There are lots of areas where statisticians can help, and I expand on these again in the previous talk and in the paper. So data collection, how to collect good data, how to get good quality data, how to use the data, ethical implementation of the details in a study. There are all kinds of issues there, like ensuring ecological validity, and not data phishing and so on. The issues of ethics during the analysis, and then reporting the results, which is something I'm going to focus on in more detail. And then just to throw this in at the end, because I want to keep reiterating it, I think teaching statistical literacy in all, not just introductory, actually in all statistics courses, is an ethical obligation on our part. So let me just give a quick overview of a study that again is in more detail in the paper and in the previous talk. This was a study that was done as part of a PhD dissertation at Cornell, and it was done in conjunction with Facebook in 2012. And what they did is randomly selected almost 700,000 Facebook users, and they assigned them to 4 groups, but there was no informed consent. So if you were on Facebook back then, you could have been one of these people and you wouldn't know it. One group had their negative news feed reduced, and another had their positive news feed reduced. And then there were some control groups. And what they looked at as the outcome was the use of negative and positive words in the subject's own posts during the period that they had their negative or positive news feed reduced. Well, this study got huge press. This was the Cornell press release, and it was all over the news. Newsfeed, emotional contagion, sweeps Facebook. Quote, people who had positive content experimentally reduced on their Facebook newsfeed for 1 week used more negative words in their status. When newsfeed negativity was reduced, the opposite pattern occurred. Significantly more positive words were used in people's status updates. And there's a link to that news report. Okay, well, here are the results. When they lowered the positive posts, the users' positive words decreased by, yeah, that's a decimal point, 0.1% compared with the control. Yeah, they got a huge t-value, 5.63, but the effect size, Cohen's d, was 0.02. Now, 0.2 is considered a low effect size. 0.02 is a minuscule effect size. Similarly, when they lowered the negative posts, the use of negative words decreased by 0.07%. So that's not just a decimal place, it's a 0 as well. And again, a D of 0.02. Now remember, they had almost 700,000 people in the study, so of course they got statistical significance. They presented these graphs. So this graph on the upper right, wow, how convincing. Look, it almost doubles, you know, et cetera, until you go over and look at the scale, 5% up to 5.4%. So misleading graph. So ethical issues from this study, at least these, there was no informed consent. They had misleading graphs. They confused statistical significance with practical importance. They had misleading reporting of the results in general. And the authors defended themselves by saying, well, yeah, it's a small effect size, but it's of practical importance because of how many people are affected. That was a new one on me, but there you have it. That was their justification. All right, so in general, ethics of reporting results. It's important to focus on magnitude, obviously, and not p-values. And we need to teach this in all of our classes, including the intro classes, because obviously with big data, small effects can have tiny p-values. It's important to include a clear explanation of uncertainty. including the fact that maybe, a confidence interval covers 0, but not just a point estimate. Don't overstate the importance of results. Graphics should obviously be clear and not misleading. Don't imply a causal connection if it's not justified. I do have to say that's one where the press seems to have gotten a lot better. It's harder to find examples where they do that. I love finding those bad, good examples, but it's not as easy these days. And then finally, I'm going to focus on this one, which is why I have it in green. Media coverage should include all relevant results, not just the most interesting or surprising, which of course is not easy to convince the media to do. Whoops. Here's a hypothetical example, and then I'm going to do a real one. Suppose a client asks you to evaluate an online game for boosting children's math skills, and they give you data on pre and post math and language scores and the time they spent studying each of those in this game. And suppose you find that the math scores went up, but the language scores went down and the game appeared to be addictive. Well, they only asked you to examine the math scores. So are you ethically bound to report the negative consequences of using the game? First of all, to the client, and second of all, if you get interviewed by the media. So that's an ethical question. And now for a real example, and again, expanded on in the paper and the previous talk. So the Women's Health Initiative was a very large study, randomized study comparing hormones for women who had gone through menopause with placebo. And there was a surprising result, which was that there was an increase in the risk of coronary heart disease in the hormone group. And it was surprising because earlier observational studies had shown a decrease in coronary heart disease if taking hormones. So based on that, the trial was actually stopped early, and millions of women were advised to stop taking hormone replacement therapy immediately. There was huge media attention on the risks of heart disease and also breast cancer, which had been previously known. Okay, however, here is a quote from the original article. Absolute excess risks per 10,000 person years attributable to the hormones were 7 more coronary heart disease, 8 more strokes, 8 more pulmonary embolism, 8 more invasive breast cancers. And here's the part that was not covered by the media. While absolute risk reductions per 10,000 person years were 6 fewer colorectal cancers and 5 fewer hip fractures. And in fact, the women who died of any cause during this study was almost exactly equivalent in the two groups, hormone and placebo. And if they adjusted for the time spent in the study, the death rate was slightly lower in the hormone group, with an annualized rate of 0.52% compared to 0.53% in the placebo group. So the media and the medical community focused on the surprising heart disease results, whereas in fact, the hormone group fared better in many ways, including the adjusted death rate. So were millions of women misled? Yeah, I think they were. I think if the full results had been reported in the media, the women could have decided for themselves, like for example, if there was a history of colon cancer and hip fracture in their family versus a history of heart disease and breast cancer. So I thought that was an example of unethical reporting. Okay, encouraging statistical literacy. Any of you who have heard me give talks know this is a huge area of interest for me. So ethics in statistics education. First of all, when we're just talking about training statisticians, we need to include ethical considerations throughout their training. And one idea suggested to me by Eric Vance is to include a discussion of ethical issues as part of all data analysis projects and even possibly dissertations in statistics and related areas that you're involved with. For all students, we should recognize that statistical literacy includes ethical issues, includes recognizing them when they read about results, and emphasize topics that students can actually use in their lives to make informed decisions and to recognize statistical errors. And again, if you've seen me give talks or read papers, you know over the years, I've had a list of what I think are important statistical literacy topics, and it keeps changing and expanding. It started with 7 in a 2003 American Statistician article, and it's up to 10. There are some new ones, like I think number 4, why many studies fail to replicate. There's a huge literature on that, and I discussed that in again in my paper and previous talk. But today I'm going to focus on number 7, poor intuition about probability and risk, because I think this is one that we don't focus on enough in our introductory classes. So let me just go there. It all started with William James, who was the father of modern psychology, when he recognized that we really have 2 kind of different minds. One is intuitive and it's quick and it's meant for survival. The other one is analytical, but it's more slow and thoughtful. It's not what we do as our first reaction. And so psychologists have used this to study many ways in which we have poor intuition about risk and probability, including statisticians, by the way. I strongly recommend this book, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And he talks about the fast thinking uses our intuitive mind, slow thinking uses our analytical mind. And I actually used this book as the focus of my ASA, for part of my ASA presidential address, which you can also find on my webpage under representative presentations. So the one I want to focus on today is one you probably all know about, but let's just think about it. The confusion of the inverse, which is the probability of A given B does not equal the probability of B given A. And you're all familiar with this one. The probability of a positive test given that you have a disease is hopefully pretty high. But that doesn't mean that the probability you have the disease given a positive test is very high, especially for rare diseases. And doctors actually get this one wrong. They don't recognize this. There's another example. It's called the prosecutor's fallacy in the courtroom. And I think I'll spend a little time on this one too. And that is that the probability of being innocent given the evidence is not the same as the probability of the evidence given that you're innocent. And I'll go into detail on that in a minute. And here's again a very recent one. People are very worried about the Delta variant. And in the UK, apparently as of today, 99% of new cases are the Delta variant. It was 90% when I checked a few days ago. So here's the thing people are really worried about. The probability that someone had been double vaccinated, given that they die, is actually almost 50%, 50 over 117 as of June 25th. But that is not the same as the probability of dying given that you're double vaccinated, which is still extremely low. And in fact, if everyone is vaccinated, just to point out how absurd it is, then the probability of being vaccinated given that you die would be 100% or 1. So people need to understand this difference. Okay, so I want to just go on a little bit about the prosecutor's fallacy. So let's suppose that we have a guy named Dan, because it goes with DNA. So Dan's DNA matches the DNA at a crime scene. And suppose only 1 in a million people have this specific DNA. And suppose there are 6 million people in the local area, so about 6 have this DNA. And let's suppose that they find Dan not because there's other evidence, but through a DNA database. So all other things being equal. Is Dan almost surely guilty? Well, here's one way to present this, and in general, how to illustrate conditional probabilities is to make a two-way table. So here's our 6 million people. 6 of them have a DNA match, the remaining ones don't. Of the 6 that have the DNA match, 1 is guilty and 5 are innocent. So the probability of a DNA match, given that Dan is innocent, is the column. So it's 5 over almost 6 million. So it's extremely low. So if Dan is, so you know, that may be what this would, of course, be what the prosecutor would emphasize. You know, this is extremely low. So how could Dan be innocent when the probability of DNA match, given that he's innocent, is so low? However, now let's look at the other way. The probability that Dan is innocent, given the DNA match, is actually 5 out of 6, which is pretty high. And that's what his defense lawyer, of course, should emphasize. Those are obviously very, very different. A more general version might be if you have rare type of evidence, use the same numbers. So the probability of being innocent given an evidence match is pretty high at 5 out of 6. But the probability of an evidence match, if you're innocent, is really tiny. And so what we get is the prosecutor would emphasize the very low one and the defense lawyer would emphasize the high one. And the point here is that juries really need to understand this difference. And who are juries? Future juries are your current students. Okay, so finally, suggestions for you. We need to train all students to think about ethics. So you should propose and discuss ethical issues in class. You should include ethics sections in all data analysis assignments. And you should train students to think about why before how. And for non-statistics students, you should teach literacy issues such as recognizing multiple analyses and selective reporting, the trade-offs in risks for some things, you know, risks and benefits, trade-offs in society benefits versus personal rights, like in using DNA databases to catch criminals or facial recognition software and so on. And then this confusion of the inverse that I just talked about. And then in preparing statistics majors for jobs, One of my colleagues at Davis long ago said, you know, numbers are not just numbers. Statisticians just analyze them. Doesn't matter where they came from. Well, that is so not true. As Rebecca Nugent pointed out in her opening keynote, if you are not talking to content experts early and often, you will be starting over. It's really important for you to get to know, for our students to get to know the content area for what they're working in. My colleague who was right in the middle of this Alzheimer's drug controversy has been working with Alzheimer's researchers for a couple decades now and is quite up to speed on the Alzheimer's issues in addition to the statistical issues, and that's really important. Often the statistician will be the most objective member of a multidisciplinary team. They won't have as much of a vested interest. And so they need to be taught to speak up as a member of a team if they see ethical issues that arise, and other issues, of course, as well. And thanks to Alan Rossman, this is his mantra, we need to train them to ask good questions, including why before how. So finally, summary and conclusions. Statistics educators should play a major role in data science ethics. Statistics majors at all levels should be thinking about ethics along with technical issues. Students who take just one course in statistics should be able to identify things like bias, confounding, selective reporting, and other misleading issues in statistical studies. And finally, a ray of hope here, statistics educators can actually change the world for the better by focusing on these things. Okay, thank you.